Hello everyone, welcome back to Rolling Solo. My name is Adam Smith, and I'm really excited today to do my top 20 solo games from 2021. It's worth mentioning that every game you're about to hear through this list is a base game except for one. I did make one exception to the rule here, and I'll mention that when I get to it. It's also worth mentioning that about a week ago I put together a video that compiled my community's voting across multiple different communities that I have for Rolling Solo, whether it be on YouTube itself, inside my Facebook group, the Discord server, or on my Patreon. There's a number of different areas there. There was voting going on for the top 20 games of the year, and that video has released already. If you haven't checked that out yet and you're coming here first, I would highly recommend you go check out that video first to get an idea as to where the community collectively has put the top 20 games of the year and in what order. It might be interesting to see that and then come back here and see my own personal lists. Now, it's worth mentioning at the very end of this video, once I get through my 20 games, I am going to put both lists on screen so you can actually take a look at both lists and compare them and, make your own deductions out of what has changed positions on the list, things that have gone up in terms of maybe games that have moved up the list, moved down the list, been pulled completely off of it, added to it. That's kind of part of the fun of these lists, is that they're very, they're a list, so they are biased. They are, subjected to a number of different things that might push you one way or the other, whether you're interested in a particular theme or IP or a game mechanism or something along those lines, can draw you towards one experience versus another, and that can cause differences in lists. So one of the other things I wanted to ask was if you guys are willing to place your own top 20, top 15, 10, 5, whatever amount of games you've actually played through this year down in the comments below. It would be a great time to share with the community a whole bunch of solo games that might not have landed on my prior videos list or this one that's coming up in a few moments, and that will just help to shed some light on some games that are great but just didn't make these lists. And we all know no list is perfect, and that includes mine. It includes the Rolling Solo Communities list or anybody else's. These are all really just used as a guiding light to drive you towards a game that might interest you or potentially have you running in the other direction. But either way, really hope you enjoy the list, and without further ado, let's go ahead and start in the 20th position. In the 20th position on my personal list of solo games from 2021, we begin with Zombicide 2nd Edition. Now, Zombicide, the original base game that had come out years ago. As we know, Zombicide has seen many iterations. Rule changes have been basically tweaked throughout the iterations. Different themes have been added. Expansions have added in different game mechanisms along the line. We know with the 2nd edition, there's a bunch of expansions that add a bunch of interesting mechanics around things like, darker areas, as well as a clock in-game and stuff like that, tracking by at the hour. There's all these little things that they seem to throw into these Zombicide games just to kind of make each of them unique, but at the core, these games are relatively carbon copy, minus the major rule tweaks that they might make based on house rules that the community has to put into place to deal with some of the more annoying things that are in place with Zombicide from way back in the day. But a lot of those things have been cleaned up in this 2nd edition, and the reason it landed on my list is really nostalgic, just from the standpoint of this Zombicide in general. For me, along with Mage Knight and Lord of the Rings the LCG, are 3 games that actually drove me to start the channel in the first place, and without all 3 of them, I don't think I would have even pulled the trigger. Maybe I would have, but I played those 3 so much that it really drove me to actually spending some time to build the channel, and so for that reason, I seem to still gravitate towards coming back and wanting to experience Zombicide when new iterations come out, even if I kind of know that going into them there's not going to be that much of a change, but there are enough changes to potentially justify revisiting it so long as you enjoy the gameplay. One thing I will mention is that I'm really hoping in the future for Zombicide that we're going to see an actual full-on revision of the game itself in terms of really pushing the envelope and what it could potentially do. I think there's more that they could pull out of Zombicide beyond just a theming and a reprint of, you know, a handful of rule changes and things like that, or some extra expansions to spice it up. Like, I think they can actually change the game from the core and actually enhance it to be maybe potentially a little bit more heavyweight of a game and a little bit more substance overall. And there was also talk about the digital platform that Cool Me or Not was exploring around, you know, using with their board games in order to enhance them, whether it have, like, you know, battery operated dice or sound effects when you move around to different rooms and stuff like that. I don't know where that project currently stands, but if that ever was to release and Zombicide was part of that mix, I can imagine that that would certainly bump it up a bit. But what you'll likely notice looking through my lists in the past is that Zombicide has begun to slip further and further and further down the list. And at some point, you probably won't even see it anymore. So really, this is just a nod to its existence, the fact that I have very good memories from it in the past and still enjoy pulling out every now and then and playing it. In the 19th position, we have Wildlands The Ancients. This is the exception to the rule. This was an expansion. It was not a core game. If you pick this up, you're not going to be able to even play the game. You need to have the original base game of Wildlands to enjoy The Ancients. But The Ancients, the reason I allowed this exception is that it adds solo play where there wasn't originally. I had bought Wildlands the first time through, played it, multiplayer, enjoyed it, wished there was some solo thing going on there, and there was nothing. And then in 2021, The Ancients came out. I grabbed it, enjoyed it, and wanted to show you guys how it played, so I put through a full playthrough of that on the channel, which you can find if you're looking to find out if this game's a fit for you. But for me personally, I really like what Wildlands does as a multiplayer game, and they did a really good job of not only making a solo playable version of the game, but also making it not easy. It's relatively tough to win the game, and there's different ways to play it, different AI or enemies to go up against, and of course, we all know with Wildlands, the terrain changes on every single board, so you have a lot of variability there. Now, just before we move to the next entry on my list, it's worth noting the last two entries were not on the Rolling Solo Board Game Communities list. So already there's been some changes, and you'll probably notice this, as I mentioned in the conclusion section of this video, when we compare the two lists. But at this point, we're now moving to the 18th position, and that is held by Setawatch Swords of the Coin. Now, Setawatch is a game that I've covered on the channel before, back when it originally landed on Kickstarter, and it's worth mentioning that this Swords of the Coin is not only an expansion to that, which you think would break the rule again, like I already did earlier, but it's also its own standalone game too. Safe. And I can tell you right now, if you're looking for a fast-playing game with very unique mechanics, I mentioned this in the prior video, that it's just the major thing I love about it is the idea that you're thematically building a fire in order to see further into the darkness. That is the coolest aspect of the game. It clicks in your brain really easily, and also the usage of the storage, the game itself essentially as a storage unit, but also as the game board, is just really cool. And also I think that, you know, Final Girl, which came out this year as well, also kind of went down that road of kind of using the game box to its own advantage and stuff like this in terms of storage and things like that, right? So I think a lot of companies are starting to think about how they could potentially even use their packaging as part of the gameplay or game board itself, especially for these smaller games, and that's exactly where this Setawatch game fits into. Is if you're looking for something that's a quick playing, not as complex game, then this is likely going to be up your alley. In the 17th position on my list is Dungeons of Infinity, and this comes from, well, now Sky Kingdom Games going into its second edition, which recently was on crowdfunding, but the first edition, which landed in 2021, was the first time I had exposure to the game, and from the cover of the game, as well as just what I read about it, I wasn't overly interested in it originally, but that changed super fast after I got the game out of the box and actually started putting the game on the table and playing it, that the actual design behind the gameplay I really, really liked. It was unique, it was different, and I hadn't played a game that was similar to it. And it also was very crunchy in terms of the numbers, in terms of just how combat works and shakes out, but also not overcomplicated either. And what I really like about Sky Kingdom Games picking it up and running with a new crowdfunding campaign is that they're basically deluxifying the entire thing. They're going to streamline the rulebook, they're going to upgrade it with game trays, really this game is going to go from a first printing to a second printing, and the jump is going to be huge. So for that reason, this sits definitely in the 17th position on my list. In the 16th position on my personal list is Wild Ascent from Lazy Squire Games. This is another one that kind of surprised me, one that I wasn't overly interested in originally, but then once I started playing the game, I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed it and continued to enjoy it from there. And it's worth mentioning that this particular game, it kind of has a structure similar to KDM in terms of like a settlement phase, as well as your, overarching combat that's happening in a particular environment against creatures. And of course, once you kill off the creatures, you can then kind of harvest them and use those resources to boost up your encampment and everything else. But what I liked about Wild Ascent in comparison to KDM, and again, these are two very different games, but structurally they're very similar, is that Wild Ascent is a very streamlined version of KDM. Essentially, it's really just getting you into the settlement mode, getting you out of it as fast as possible. So you're in and out, you do some upgrades, and then you move on to another combat, and you're just trying to survive through all of that. I really found it to be fun, and it was also nice to just be able to pull it out, play it, and put it away, so you could take it kind of as one-off scenarios whenever you felt like it. So this is one to keep an eye on, and their second reprint that they went through, which added even more content to the fray, was extremely popular, and I'm really looking forward to what it offers, or I should say delivers, in the near future. Alright, so we've reached the 15th position on the list. It belongs to Awaken Realms. It's The Great Wall, and this is a worker placement game, and I definitely want to mention that this game is tipping towards the heavier side of the equation. It's worth mentioning that there have been some rulebook clarifications, as some of the stuff going on in the rulebook isn't exactly 100% clear, but the solo play that it provides in The Great Wall is worth checking out. And it wasn't just kind of baked in and thrown in there on the side. It was well done, and I really enjoyed it, and it's going to be a game that actually sticks around in my collection, as it's something that Awaken Realms really hasn't dabbled much in around the worker placement stuff. I mean, typically we've seen games like Tainted Grail and Nemesis, Aetherfields, and stuff like that. So a worker placement from them that nails the solo play for me is a reason to keep this one around, and one that definitely deserves a spot on this list. Moving right along to the 14th position on my personal list is Cartographer's Heroes. This comes from Thunderworks Games and is an addition to Cartographers that came out back in 2019, adding a whole bunch more content to enjoy as you're trying to gain all kinds of reputation stars by the end of seasons, all 4 seasons, in fact, in order to win the game. And as a solo game, it really is a great one. I do enjoy it quite a bit, and it definitely deserved a position on this list. It might be overshadowed by games like Role Player or Role Player Adventures, but I highly recommend you take a look further into Cartographers. Now, just as a recap for those of you that are following along, and again, at the end of this video in the conclusion, you'll see the differences between the Rolling Solo list and my list, but as of right now, 5 games additionally have been added to the list to this point already that weren't on the Rolling Solo Board Game Community's list. This next one was on their list, and it's Euthea in the 13th position, Torment of Resurrection. This comes from Dia Games. This is one that also surprised me this year. Another one that I looked at and went, I'm not 100% sure this is going to do anything different than I haven't seen before, but the design of the game and the way it was developed was so well done. Plus, the solo play inside of it is really interesting, and you'll realize quite quickly after a game or two that this game really starts to open up. There's a lot going on inside of Euthea, and you only really scratch the surface of the game in the first handful of plays, but as you become more familiar with the game really does open up, and you see so many options out there to go and interact with, and it really does it does a great job of making you feel like you're part of a larger world, especially with those hex tiles. So definitely recommend you check that one out. We now move to the 12th position on my personal list. That belongs to Chronicles of Crime from Lucky Duck Games. That is 1400, 1900, and 2400. As I did with the Rolling Solo Communities list, these have all been combined together. And the reason this landed on the list is because for me personally, I'm a huge fan of these games. From the original Chronicles of Crime that landed, the thing I loved that it did was it did such a good job of a 50-50 split with the app as well as what's going on the table. Plus the fact that you could condense an actual detective work down to around an hour or so of play, so you can actually finish that game in a reasonable amount of time. There's many different detective-based games out there, whether they be like Sherlock Holmes or Detective from Portal Games, but some of those will take you hours to solve, or a lot of paying attention and digging very deep in order to get down to the end of each of those particular crimes to try to figure out who actually did what. Whereas Chronicles of Crime, it kind of aimed to streamline all of that, and it did it so well without dumbing it down to a spot where it felt easy. And I really enjoy what it does and hope that more of it comes out in the future. We are getting dangerously close to the top 10 of this list, and in the 11th position we have Merchant's Cove, another game which was not on the Rolling Solo Board Game Community list. This one for me was a winner. I really enjoyed this, covered this on the channel, but I recommend and almost require you, if you're going to pick up Merchant's Cove, to grab the Secret Stash expansion, as it fully bolsters out the solo experience. If you just grab the core game, it's going to be good, but in order to make it great, you're going to need the Secret Stash. It's really going to add a lot to the replayability of the game. Plus, for every other role that you pick up, and there's expansions for additional roles beyond the ones that are included inside the box, you're going to have variability in terms of the different mini games that you're playing, because you're essentially in this game, it's definitely a Euro game. And you're going to be going ahead and having a bunch of individuals show up on the shoreline. You're working in a town, whether it be the alchemist, the innkeeper, an oracle, whatever it is. Each of them has their own minigame and how they create wares and goods that they're trying to sell for money to these people that have showed up at the port. And the coolest part is that if you just switch who you control in terms of each and every game you play solo, you'll feel like you're playing a different minigame within the same core set of rules every time you play. It's just a really cool game that way, because most games, well, once you've played them once, if you change characters, yeah, there's some variation, but the differences are quite minor. Whereas in this one, you will feel the differences not only in the components but also in the game mechanisms in terms of how the goods are actually produced and what you need to do in order to make that happen. It's very cool. Highly recommend you check it out. Got videos for it on the channel if you want to see more. Merchant's Cove. We are now inside the top 10 for 2021 on my personal list. This belongs to Hull & Nothing Productions. This is Veil Wraith. I am very happy with this card game. This is a card game that does not take a long time to set up. It doesn't take a long time to play. It is not a heavy card game, but it is not an easy one. It's also worth mentioning that the base game, it comes with a handful of vignettes, but not a ton. So I highly recommend you pick up the expansion for this one, as well as it will bolster it up to, I believe, 20 vignettes, which is much more of an enjoyable experience overall, as you have to try to rip through all 20 of those with a certain number of lives. Now, the thing about this game that I've mentioned in the past that's really interesting is that the gameplay has been built so smoothly that you'll play a game and want to just keep playing, and keep playing. It will hook you very quickly. And you'll like it from the standpoint that most of your turns will move smoothly until you hit a turn within a vignette where you're going to have to make a really tough call, and you're going to have to decide one way or the other, and it's going to have ripple effects, positive or negative, as you continue to play through. You'll see whether that pans out the way you hoped it did, and there's just so many moments in this game that kind of keep you on the edge of the seat as to, am I going to be able to pull this out, or am I going down the tubes here? And this is just one that just blew me away. I just was really impressed by it, especially when you're talking about the color palette being black and white, and you're going, well, there's no color to this one, so the gameplay better be good. And that's where a lot of people, their heads went. But they also have to realize, and I mentioned this in my previous top 20 video, that with this game, the color palette was specifically chosen based on the story behind the game itself. Again, also inside this Kill Forth universe. So it's worth mentioning that it was done on purpose. And but the thing is, the gameplay is where this game really shines. And I really recommend that if you're looking for a solo game that will keep you hooked and challenge you, Veil Wraith is what you want to grab. In the 9th position on my personal list, it belongs to Destinies from Lucky Duck Games. This is a game I've tabled very, very recently, solo and with friends and family. Still playing this game, still enjoying it, and wanted to make mention of the fact it is app-driven, so you'll have, half your time you'll be dealing with the app, the other half you'll be dealing with things on the tabletop. So that might interest you, or it may not. It's also worth mentioning this originally had ties to Joan of Arc, and that IP, that had to be disconnected. I don't know if there will be much more for Destinies in the future or not. That's really a question I don't have an answer to, but I could see the system for Destinies being used with something else in the future, and who knows what that might be, but I really hope they bring it back in a different capacity, or even in the same capacity if that works. But regardless, I'm enjoying my time with it. If you're playing solo, you have Explorer mode on one side and you have Challenger mode on the other. Explorer gives you unlimited time. You can do whatever you want, and you usually and generally could pretty much explore the majority of this scenario in one run, maybe 2 runs fully to check off everything, or 3 maybe to do everything. If you're going that route, or if you go the Challenger route, you're trying to min-max yourself in order to win, because you are timed at that point. So you're going to have to replay the scenario a number of times before you get to a point where you're familiar with it enough to know exactly where you need to move and what you need to interact to do. Now, for me personally, I would normally say I want the narrative side sometimes, and other times I want the Challenger side, depending on my mood. But I would actually recommend, if you want replayability out of Destinies, and this is definitely how I recommend it, you go the Challenger route first and play the scenario 2-3 times, whatever amount you need in order to beat the Challenger mode. And once you've beaten it, then go over to the Explorer mode and play through it once in order to fill in all the gaps of the story that you weren't able to cover in the Challenger mode. And at that point, after you've played 3 to 4 times, you've probably seen everything inside of a given scenario, but you've also gotten the most use out of one scenario. I think if you just gun at it from an Explorer only perspective, you'll probably be done in about a play or 2. And you may not come back to that scenario after that unless you want to play far into the future when you forget what happened and what the story is. But long story short, I really do enjoy Destinies. There's enough expansion content that you can pick up for the game as well in order to enjoy it even further into the future, and really hope they do more with it down the line. In the 8th position on my personal list for 2021 is Assassin's Creed Brotherhood of Venice. This comes from Triton Noir. It came from a Kickstarter campaign, which has since delivered, and I have no idea if there's a reprint coming. I'd imagine there is, because it was extremely popular and has been very well received. For me personally, when it landed, I was excited for it because I wanted to see what they were going to do with the IP and bring it over to the tabletop. And sometimes these things don't work, and other times they do. This is an example, another good one, of when they do. They did a great job implementing Assassin's Creed to the tabletop here. On top of that, they also implemented one of the best learn to plays inside of one of these larger campaign games I have seen to date, and I still love it. Literally taking you through memories, which are divided up into sequences, as you are familiar with from the video game. And as you move through these, it's literally opening up envelopes and also opening up mechanisms within the game and explain them to you as you go along. So you do not have to sit there and read the entire rule book to get the game to the table and have fun with it. You can simply just start playing, and the game will guide you to where you need to read the rule book for additional information, and then it will introduce additional mechanisms within the game as you play through these different sequences until you get to a point where you've basically covered everything. But the way in which they did that was so smooth and seamless, it surprised me. I was expecting to have to read a gigantic book and keep a whole bunch of rules in my head in order to just table the thing and enjoy it. You'll be really, really surprised. That is not the case. So if this comes back for a reprint, or it's available used somewhere, or they happen to get it back on their store, definitely recommend you check this one out. It is an absolute winner. All right, so in the 7th position on the list, we have Descent Legends of the Dark. This is an app-driven game from Fantasy Flight Games. This is one that costed quite a bit when it landed. It has been seen discounted here and there every once in a while, but it's still a relatively expensive game still, but you're getting a lot inside the box. And I definitely recommend solo players take a look at this if you kind of excused it as an app game or a game that might not be up your alley. It actually has quite a a few surprises in store for you. Now, one of the things I really enjoyed while playing through it was the fact that each and every scenario as you actually play through it makes really great use and creative use of the components and the game design. So as you play through each of the scenarios in the game, you're not just doing, a typical dungeon crawler explorer type thing where you go from A to Z, oh look, I found the big chest, on to the next room where we do the exact same thing. This game's going to throw differences at you between the scenarios and how they're set up, how they're laid out, how they work, how they function. It's really going to make you go, huh, interesting. And every single time you play one of the scenarios, you're going to want to play the next one to see what they put together in this next scenario. There's a lot of things to like about the app design as well in comparison to many of the other apps they put out in the past. This one has to be up there as either the best, if not the second best app they've ever put out. It handles all your campaign management in between your game states perfectly. I absolutely love it. You can do all your crafting and stuff inside of there. You can goof around with it on the side when you're not even playing the game. And then on top of it, during the gameplay itself, it handles the one section of most dungeon crawlers struggle with, which is streamlining combat to a point where you're not spending an obscene amount of time crunching numbers and just trying to get past the enemies that are in front of you. As we all know, most dungeon crawlers have enemies, checks, or something, obstacles that we have to get past. But, having an app there that can kind of push you through that at a quicker pace, it's a huge advantage, and it helps to keep the excitement of what comes next, which is the surprise factor that everyone loves in dungeon crawlers, at the forefront instead of behind a whole bunch of time-consuming combat. So, long story short, I like what they did, I like the design of it, and I'm really intrigued to see what else is coming down the line for this. Alright, and this is where we get into the part of the list where I start making some shocking changes from what the Rolling Solo community had pegged as their top games when they got into their top 10. So in the 6th position on my list is Sleeping Gods from Red Raven Games, a fantastic exploration adventure game that gives you all kinds of options, the ability to literally control a crew and a ship, to manage what's going on in that crew and that ship, keeping them all happy, safe, healthy, and on top of it, maintaining the ship itself as you set sail on an adventure that's going to take you all over the place. And to be completely honest, it is a fantastic adventure game. For me personally, though, it wasn't the top of the list. Now, in the prior list that I put out, the Rolling Solo community had it as number 1, and it wasn't even number 1 by like a small margin. It was actually number 1 by a large margin. But for me personally, it wasn't the first game out of these 20 games that I would grab off the shelf if I had to choose between them. There's a handful of other ones that I would grab ahead of this one. However, as I mentioned before, these lists could change week on week. There could be a week where I'm so into my Sleeping Gods experience that it actually would sit in the 3rd, 2nd, or 1st position on this list. So again, this is all point-in-time snapshot talk in terms of this list. But Sleeping Gods belongs on the list. It absolutely belongs in the top 10 of 2021. For me, it sits at 6. And without further ado, we've reached the top 5 of my list for 2021. Really excited to go through these 5 games. The 5th position belongs to Chronicles of Drunagor, Age of Darkness from Creative Games Studios, a dungeon crawler that, for me, definitely nailed it. They did a whole bunch of things differently. The cube management in terms of the usage of the cubes related to the color on the character boards, that was really cool because it kind of, basically makes you strategize as to how you should take actions and what you should do on your turn. You don't have kind of open-ended actions that you can just take attacks whenever you want them. You're rolling a die on a d20, which is very, very fun because you can have all these things go very, very well or very, very poorly. And also just the game presence on the table itself was so much fun. It looks like fun. Like when you pull the game out of the box and you set it up, people are going to go, I want to play that. Not only does it look cool, it has elevation going on in the game. There's the surprise factor of busting through a door, not knowing what's on the other side. There is a choose-your-own-adventure mentality to it, where you have different choices that will change the outcome of your current scenario or potentially a future scenario. The doors, as I mentioned, kind of like open up and they kind of reveal what's going on behind them. You're sometimes going to be pulled into an interactions book where you might find a statue and there's like 8 different things you can do with the statue, but you're only limited to do a couple actions and you have to choose. Like, there's all these things going on that just keep drawing you back in the experience and making the game fun. And it's just constant. And then on top of all that, you're managing darkness, which is spreading everywhere and causing you all kinds of grief. Long story short, if you have not looked into Chronicles of Drunagor or the videos I put up over this year for it, including the new campaign that's already out there, funded like crazy, and I know there's a number of you probably that are waiting for the original game from that campaign, you're going to have a lot of fun when that thing arrives. In the number 4 position on my personal list is Final Girl from Van Ryder Games, a game that is going to put you in a horror setting where you are dealing with a killer or some type of spiritual entity or something horrific that wants to take you out. And as the final girl, you're going to need to use your wits, your dice, your cards in order to manage and make through the scenario alive, hopefully, if you can pull it off. Now, the packaging for this game, very unique, very interesting. I've heard comments around some people loving it, some people hating it, but I've also heard that with the brand new campaign coming in January, very early January in 2022, that there's going to be more content coming and also a potential solution storage-wise for the game as it grows even further. And I think Van Ryder Games has a winner here in the solo community with Final Girl. It's getting a lot of attention and it's rightly deserved. I had a blast covering the prototype when I did. So if you want to see gameplay, I do have that, which will help you. And I'm also looking to put out some gameplay in 2022 as well around Final Girl, and I think that's going to be a lot of fun. We've now reached my top 3 for the year, and in the 3rd position, I've placed Bloodborne, the board game from Cool Mini or Not, an absolute winner in my books, and another fantastic example of how you should translate a video game to a tabletop and do it in style. The game looks fantastic on the table, it's unique, and the one thing I loved about the design was that they didn't take the easy way out and just use dice and a bunch of other things in order to make this game happen. They took it the extra mile to make it feel like Bloodborne when you're actually playing the game. When you're trying to take down all these miniatures, as most of us know, Cool Mini or Not packs a ton of miniatures into their games, every single enemy in the game feels unique. There's 2 sides to their cards, you can kind of switch them up in terms of what they can do to you, and of course you're going to have to change how you actually take down these enemies based on the cards and that you have in your hand, and how you play them is going to be a huge factor in whether or not you win or not. So it doesn't come down to random chance as to whether you take out an enemy. You have to strategically dodge, you have to strategically try and stun enemies or, you know, attack them at specific times, and there's other times, just like the video game, where attacking isn't the best option. The best option is to run away, and it literally can be. And I just love that they put all of that care and love from the video game into the tabletop experience, so that for those that understand it and know it can really appreciate it. And it was beyond fan service, in my opinion. It was everything I could have hoped it would have been, and definitely believe that it should be in the top tier of this year. It's one that's going to be passed over by people, as you know, there are some of these games, and Cthulhu Death May Die is a great example. It took quite a bit for people to kind of get on board with it. They were like, yeah, it's probably good, I don't know, I might try it. And then one day they tried it and they went, oh my gosh, this game is a blast to play. Bloodborne is also a lot of fun to play. And for me personally, it sits at the number 3 position and isn't slumping anywhere down the list from there. Number 2 on my personal list belongs to Role Player Adventures from Thunderworks Games, one that came to me very close to the tail end of the year and one of the most recent showcases I did on the channel, and was one of the games that shook me the most in terms of excitement and happiness level as I played through that game. Everything about the design of this game is pretty much everything I wanted to see. I got exactly what I was hoping to see from the actual campaign when it launched. The gameplay is awesome. I mentioned this in the other list video that I put out. Role Player Adventures essentially revives Role Player in a way by allowing you to bring your original characters from the original Role Player game into this new Adventures campaign. And that's just really exciting because it kind of revives a game that was already very good, and now kind of makes it almost even more exciting to play that first and then translate that character over to Role Player Adventures and continue on from there. And I just like everything about it. I'm going to consume, and I'm continuing to consume, everything in Role Player Adventures. I'll probably have the entire game completely beaten before they even have a chance to announce that any new future content is coming down the pipes. I'm really, really happy with this one, and I can't say that enough. I think if I was going to recommend a game out of this list that I think would work for anybody in terms of a general recommendation, I think Role Player Adventures is the highest or easiest game to recommend across any of the games in this list for this year. So if anyone came to me and said, hey, what's a great solo game from 2021? It's Role Player Adventures. At this point, I'm really excited because we have now made it to the first position on the list, the most important. Which game was my top game of 2021? It was Solomon Kane from Mythic Games. This is a game that I truly think is not only going to be a very popular solo game, but also going to change the way in which games are designed going forward in terms of adventure games and dungeon crawlers. And I will describe to you what I mean by that, and I think this is part of the reason why I gravitated so heavily towards this game during this year, is how it approached its design. For me, going into the board game, I had very little familiarity with the IP and actually became more familiar with it through the board game. I had seen the movie that came out years ago, but that was about it. That's all I did, and I don't even think I remembered most of it when the board game arrived. But as I played through the board game, it actually sucked me in very, very quickly. Essentially, you have Solomon Kane, who is part of a scenario, and there's NPCs, and there's a bunch of other characters involved in the scenario, and stuff like this. There's talking, interactions happening, checks happening between the characters, but you are controlling a virtue. Now, if you're playing solo, you can control 4 virtues all at once if you wish to do that, and all 4 virtues have a strength that's kind of assigned to them. Or you can say, I don't want to manage 4 separate virtues, that's a lot. Let's just, go grab Providence, which is the virtue to rule them all, and just control one of those virtues. Now, what is a virtue? It is literally a character, a miniature that exists on the game board, but in the spirit realm. So when you think about Solomon Kane on the tabletop, you're thinking about a number of individuals that are literally part of a scene, I want to call it, as you're playing out the scene and interfering and kind of influencing the scene. And that involves Solomon Kane and those other NPCs. But then you're going to have virtues that are sitting behind the veil in the spiritual realm that are also sitting in miniature form on that board. Plus, you're going to have darkness entities that are going to show up on the game board and also be placed on the board. So what's happening there? Well, Solomon Kane cannot turn around and slice up one of those entities in the darkness, in the spirit realm. Can't touch it, can't do anything to it. But what can happen is the darkness can actually influence Solomon Kane negatively, whereas the virtues can influence Solomon Kane positively. And as a person playing the game, you get with your character board, so for instance, if you're using Providence, you're able to move Providence around to have influence on the game board and to help Solomon Kane, or to potentially ward away the darkness in the spirit realm, or you can actually move Solomon Kane around the board. This basically creates a 2-dimensional approach to a dungeon crawler or adventure game that is, from what I can understand, non-existent to date. I have never seen this happen before, and I mean, maybe it has in some other game, and somebody can let me know, but I've never seen it, where you actually have to worry about 2 different realms, per se, within the same instance on the table. And I think that's really cool. And those things are connected in certain ways. They're basically modifying checks. The spirit realm, darkness for the negative side of things, virtues for the positive side of things, modifying checks that are happening inside of that scene. But you have control of not only things that Solomon Kane is doing and influencing what he does and where he moves, but also moving the virtues around. And it makes the game so awesome. Like, I can't even get over how great that design is, because it takes the boring aspects of a dungeon crawler and adventure game, the downtime aspects of those games where you typically would say, oh, it's my turn. I'm gonna, in Solomon Kane, you roll dice and you slot them into cards on your virtue board that allow you to do something. So let's say, you've rolled your dice, you've slotted the dice in, you go, oh, I'm gonna move this time, and then I'm gonna, interact or attack or fight or whatever. So let's say you're moving and fighting. That's a typical thing to do in dungeon crawlers in most places, or adventure games. So your movement in most games is just kind of like, it's almost like the thing you have to do, like to get in place to do the attack. So it's not really like that exciting. So in other words, half your turn is boring. It's kind of like, well, you know, I want to do a slash attack against this individual in the corner, so I kind of need to move towards him to get beside him to hit him. So I obviously need to use my movement to move towards him. It's almost like the game's there's no joy in that, because the game, you need to do it. It's a requirement to get to the attack. The attack is the fun part. The movement's boring in most of these cases. But in Solomon Kane, the movement's actually interesting and strategic, because if you want to move Solomon Kane closer to somebody to interact with them, or to fight with them, or to do whatever with them in a certain check, you are also thinking about how the virtues are going to impact those checks, how the darkness is going to impact those checks negatively, and then deciding whether that position on the game board is a smart move or not. It's like literally playing a little bit of chess in there, because you're kind of going, well, I can move there right now, and yeah, there's a penalty, but my virtue kind of offsets it, so it's not so bad. And like, it makes movement strategic. It makes movement fun, I guess is a better way. Maybe not strategic is not the best word, but fun. And not pointless. And I find in too many of these dungeon crawler and adventure games, movement is just something you kind of are forced to do, because you need to be in a certain range from the enemy to hit them, or you need to be beside them to interact. But in Solomon Kane, it's like, yeah, those things are present. You still need that to do that. But you need to also think about the after effect of, like, how is the darkness going to mess with you if you move to that position? How is your virtue going to protect you if you move to that position? Oh, maybe you shouldn't go there. Maybe you should go over somewhere else. And it throws a whole other element of strategy, which is why I want to call it two-dimensional. It makes the game two-dimensional, because you're not just thinking about the characters that are present in the scene. You're thinking about the spirit realm that's going on in the scene. Totally awesome. I love it. And the greatest thing about it is they implemented it with a game that already has such a massive importance level around the spiritual aspect of the game, that it just ties in perfect. It's like the game design is literally the epitome of designing for the IP and for the story and the feel of the game. So the game, to me, drips with theme when I play it. It literally feels like I'm playing Solomon Kane, and there's no other design of that game that I could ever see, or I couldn't see anyone else doing a better job of designing that game. It can't happen. It's perfect. It's flawless. Now, of course, there are some quirks in terms of the wording. I think there's an errata pack that's actually coming with Wave 2 to kind of work on some of the things that were maybe not explained as well and things like that, right? That happens with most Kickstarter games. There's a couple spots here and there where it's like, well, that wasn't so great. But they are fixing that stuff, and I really, really hope that Mythic Games is going to come back with a reprint, because this is a gem. And this is a gem that I think is going to get passed over by people going, well, yeah, it's probably just like everything else, it's another one of those ones where there's some narrative and you move through and you hack and slash everybody and you do some checks. It's probably not that great. It really is a lot of fun. And it's great at all player counts. It's awesome with other people too. But as a solo player, what's amazing and what I loved is that they didn't just sit there and say, well, you know what, the solo player has to control all 4 virtues. Because typically if you're playing multiplayer, each person would have a virtue. They didn't just say, well, forget that. We'll just give the solo player all 4 of them, and they just have to handle that in every situation. They actually made a solo player specific virtue that's like the all-powerful virtue. So you can just control 1 if you want. It's just really powerful. But the only downside of it strategically is now the aura that it protects is only in 1 spot on the game board. You now don't have 4 of them in different spots modifying 4 different stats, essentially. It's just really cool. It's so cool. It's so well designed. It's a lot of fun. Highly recommended. And that's why it landed as my number 1. And when the Wave 2 delivery arrives, it will be a very, very exciting day for me. So in conclusion, I want to just talk at a high level between the two lists you're seeing on screen here, the differences between the two major sections of each of these lists, and that's really the bottom half and the top half. And the bottom half is positions 11 through 20, which there was quite a bit of differences between the community's list and mine. And you can see those on screen right now. Again, a majority of that was mainly because I had to strip away a number of games that I wasn't able to actually obtain or get access to during 2021, but are certainly on my list to try and obtain in 2022. They just won't make this list, unfortunately, because they either sold out because they are that good, which I'm not sure they are yet, have to play them, or some of them are just hard to find in Canada in general, just due to shipping issues and everything else going on in the world. But the top 10 of these lists, these two lists, is where things are really interesting, because this is where, you know, if I was to say to you, you know, put together a top 10 list and please share it, which I did at the beginning of the video, and I really hope you guys will go ahead and put together a list and share it down below, because that's really, really fun to go through those and find gems that were not mentioned, because there's a whole bunch of other ones out there that are great that might not have been listed here in either of these two lists. But these top 10s typically have more overlap than normal, usually, because this is usually where you can find kind of the game of the year material in these top 10 games in most people's lists. And the more overlap you see across these top 10s across people's lists is where you see the more popular games rising up. So for the Rolling Solo Communities list, more people on average had Sleeping Gods way up higher on the chart. Whereas for me personally, I had it set at the 6th position, which is not low. It's actually quite high. And, you know, on any given day, that might change and go higher, but today it's a 6. But to everybody else, overall on average, it was a 1. It was the top game. And that's kind of where those differences can come from. But it's really cool to see how, you know, different people, you know, latch on to different experiences that they're trying to go after, right? And for me personally, Solomon Kane was the experience I wanted in 2021. Whereas for some other people, the experience in Sleeping Gods was exactly what they wanted. Or for somebody else, maybe it was Descent. Or for somebody else, it was Assassin's Creed. And that's kind of the joy with these lists. So I would love to see your list down below in the comments so we can peruse all through a bunch of solo games and just see what people are into at the moment. But that is really going to wrap up 2021 in terms of lists at this point. The only video that I plan to release going into January, if time permits, but it will certainly happen sometime between January and February, is a follow-up to my Test of Time video, which I did last year, which is where I covered games that released, notable games that released a decade ago. And the reason I like doing this is it's really fun to look back at the games that really shaped the future in terms of design, in terms of popularity, in terms of hidden gems, all that kind of stuff. And every single year that games come out, there are gems in there in terms of design and impact that have ripple effects for many years to come down the line. There are games in these lists that you're seeing right now that are going to change the way board games are designed or the focus of designers going forward in the future. And that's just the way it goes. You know, there's inspiration that comes from games that land in higher tiers on these lists, because people look at them and go, well, what's special about them? What is unique about them? What can I do to make that game even better? What mechanic or mechanism in a game can I really, you know, push the envelope on in order to make it truly special and shine in my next iteration of a game? And it's those kind of things that are really fun to kind of look back on. So that's what my video series does, is kind of looks back 10 years and just kind of highlights the games that were special back then, that really had an impact and they had longevity and are still hopefully being played today. That's going to pretty much wrap it up. I am exhausted. It is getting late into the night. It is getting close to the end of 2021 in terms of when I'm filming this. When this video releases, it'll be 2022. So happy New Year's to everybody again. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you like what I do here at Rolling Solo and you want to support me going into 2022, please join my Patreon. We'd love to have you there. Got a whole bunch of behind the scenes stuff that I'm going to be offering going into 2022, and I'm changing up the way in which I'm doing that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, keep on rolling solo.